Mark Shapiro said, hey, we had a guy running ESPN that I think you should talk to. And he gave Dan Snyder my name. And I'll never forget that day when Dan called me and said, hey, I want to talk to you. I'm going to send my helicopter. I ended up not riding on his helicopter, which I should have figured out a way to do that. But I said, look, I said, are you going to be in New York anytime soon? I'm already in New York. I don't have to ride your helicopter. He goes, as a matter of fact, I'll be in New York next week. So we got together in person in New York. I should have held out for the helicopter ride.
I can't believe you passed on the helicopter ride, man.
Benztown president Dave Chachi Dennis loves radio and all of his radio friends.
Hey, Chachi.
Hey, everybody.
Because Chachi loves everybody.
My next guest has been named Sports Radio Program Director of the Year 3 times. He's been recognized in Radio Inc.'s annual list of top programmers. He's also been the recipient of the coveted Andrew Ashwood Award, honoring the broadcaster that made the most positive impact in the radio business. Please welcome the SVP of Sports for Cumulus and Westwood One, Bruce Gilbert. Bruce, thanks for jumping on with me today.
Thrilled to do it. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You joining us from Dallas, right?
I am, yes. Good old hot Texas.
It's a great town. I like it in Dallas. How long have you been there?
This is my second time in Dallas, and I've been back since 2010, so 11 years this time, and the first time was about 6, so I'm almost a certified Texan at this point.
Well, it's a good place to be. I was just there a few weeks ago, and I'm really a big fan of Dallas. I want to start off by jumping into your childhood, because most people I interview, their parents really kind of wanted them to stay away from radio. But you, on the other hand, your entire family was in the business, and this kind of blows my mind. But your father is a broadcaster. His name's Gary Voss. He was in the radio business since 1963. He was a reporter, an anchor, did play-by-play. Your brother Mike is a market manager for Good Karma in Chicago, and he also launched the Sports Hub in Boston. And then your sister Becky hosts afternoons at WIQI in Westaka, Illinois. So what was it like growing up in your childhood?
Yeah, my poor mother, God bless her. We all would, talk about promotions and quarter-hour ratings at Thanksgiving, and I think she just wanted to talk about anything. But it was great. It was great. I was born in the Midwest, and my dad, he took a news job in 1963. And that's the year that President Kennedy was shot. So he's got some real stories about, being in the newsroom in a small town radio station, when the old AP machine bells were going off and all kinds of noises were happening on that particular night. But he tells some great stories from those times. But yeah, I grew up around, and so did my brother and sister. We grew up, going to hang out at the radio station with my dad. And that's where the magic ensued, right? I mean, you would go into those studios and you'd see, we were just little kids. You'd see these grown men and women speaking into microphones, and then you'd imagine where their voice was going. And you would just paint this, unbelievable picture of this magic technology that allows you to be in everybody's car and in everybody's home. And I just thought it was the coolest thing, to be at a radio station and watch people, broadcast and speak into a microphone and communicate with people who you knew were out there, but you couldn't see or touch. It was just early in life, I found it to be fascinating, and still do to this day. I still love the magic and the intimacy of this medium.
That must have been wild to be exposed to it at such an early age. So for you, it's always really been kind of normalcy.
Yeah, it has. And I think, not only was it normal because my dad was so gracious to let us, hang out with him at the office, but I think it also inspired, this career for all 3 of us, for my sister and my brother and me. We looked at it and we said, this is something we can do, that we've learned a lot from our dad, and it's a career and it's fun. And it turned into, all 3 of us making a living this way. And, that's pretty special. And I feel pretty lucky. I know a lot of my friends struggled with, what were they going to do when they grew up, and from the time I was 5 years old, I just wanted to talk up the ramp to a hit song and nail the post. That's all I wanted to do,
So is your dad, and I know you and your dad were very close. I remember you telling me a story a few years ago when the Cubs finally won the World Series. I think you were on the road somewhere, so you were in a hotel room, but you were watching the game that they clinched together, and it was very emotional, I recall, for both of you. I think you cried even on the phone.
Oh, are you kidding? Yeah, I mean, that was amazing. I was in Birmingham, Alabama, with our great team at Jocks FM, spending some time with them. And, I booked the trip as a lifelong Cubs fan, saying to myself, yeah, they're good, but they'll blow it. They'll never make it to the World Series. They'll never win. I'm going to go ahead and book this trip and go to Birmingham. And I watched Game 6 in a Hilton Garden Inn, all by myself, which I think was actually wonderful, because had they lost, I probably would have, broken something. But after the amazing rain delay, when the Cubs then came back and won it, I got my brother and my dad on the phone, and I don't think we talked for 5 minutes. We just sobbed. It was amazing. I mean, that's another thing. My dad gave me radio and the Cubs. So it was a long time coming. And I mean, it just meant so much because we bonded through radio and baseball all my life. Not that we didn't bond in other ways, because he's an amazing man, but we bonded on those two things. That was always the points of conversation, radio and the Chicago Cubs. And I wouldn't be here without him. I wouldn't have half the ability to do what I do without him. And then for that to happen, I think he had decided that it wasn't going to happen in his lifetime, that the Cubs were going to win a World Series. So for him to get to experience that it was a remarkable moment. And one of those moments that, we're talking about radio, but one of the reasons I feel so lucky to be in sports radio is because of the way sports unites us, and the way sports, brings us together, and the way sports becomes, that talking point and those memorable moments that you share. And that's one I'll never forget as long as I live. So it was pretty cool. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. No, I love just a beautiful story, and I just really love hearing about your childhood and the fact that do you have a sibling that's not in the business, or you all went into the business?
No, I'm the middle child. My sister's the oldest. She's the biggest ham. She's Mike and I have both gone the management route. I mean, Mike was really good as a disc jockey. He was a really good on-air talent. I was horrible on the air. That's why I knew I had to get into management. It wasn't my forte. And so I've always been fascinated by the analytics and the research and the data and the ratings. And I have more of that brain function. My sister is a complete and total ham. She's hilarious. She's a great storyteller, and she's always just done small market radio and been a huge fish in a small pond. She's beloved. And so she's still on the air. Mike and I have kind of gone the management route, but we've all, thanks to our dad, done all aspects of the business. I mean, all I wanted to do was be on the air. And when my dad owned a radio station in Wisconsin and we were all working for him, he said, I'm not going to let you be on the air unless you also sell advertising, which I thought, oh my God, I got to go out and sell. And he gave me a list. And I was 17 years old, I think, and in a small town in Wisconsin, going out and calling on these little, automotive parts dealers, bar owners, car dealers. And it was a great education. I didn't like it. I did okay. But what I got from it more than anything was a huge appreciation for how difficult that job is. And I will never look down on a salesperson in my entire career, because what they do is so hard and they get told no so much. And I just respect people that are really, really good at that. And thankfully, I get to work with some that are the best in the business. And I admire them. And I know that without them, we aren't a complete business unit. So I learned that lesson young, again, thanks to my dad.
I agree completely. My ex-wife is an account executive. She sold for KFI for many years, and it is an incredibly tough job. And I actually recommend to all air talent, if you've not gone out and sold yourself, you really should go out with an AE and make a few calls with them and kind of experience it, because it's incredibly challenging. And I think it's also important to see just the needs of the clients and what we can do as an industry to better serve them and ultimately get them the results that they want and need.
That's the best point of all all, Chachi, is, I think that's what I learned more than anything is we have all these preconceived assumptions or just beliefs of what the client needs. The client needs this, or we should do that for the client. And, the truth is you don't have any idea what the client wants, needs, or expects unless you speak with them one-to-one. And I think one of the things I love about the way sports radio has evolved is that, to me, and I guess you could argue this, it is the number one format for advertising endorsements. And the air talent on sports stations are terrific spokespeople for the advertisers that they represent. And in many cases, especially in the biggest markets, those air talent and those clients have become friends. Over the years, they have bonded and they've maintained this relationship that is valuable from a business perspective, but they have these personal relationships that makes that business relationship thrive because the air talent has a real understanding of what makes the business work for that particular client, whoever it might be. And I think that's really cool and a unique aspect, not a unique aspect, all other formats do endorsements, but sports, I think, has really led the way in doing that in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. And there's something that I have so much respect for sports and the format as a whole because it's something that the entire family can enjoy and be part of. And it really kind of transcends, just like you were talking about your father, generations. And families can be generational fans of the Cubs or whoever it may be. And it really becomes part of a legacy and something that the family kind of believes in and can all do together. And there's not a lot of those things, I think, left anymore or at least not to the same degree as I'd like to see in our society. So I've got a lot of respect for sports and what you guys do for the community and for also families as a whole.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's true. You're right. Some of the old traditions of, gathering around the TV for primetime television shows or, having dinner with the whole family at a set time, those have become more and more difficult as the years have gone by. But when you're in the car, now I have a 12-year-old son and he's in the car with me and I'm listening to sports radio and, he's picking up things and becoming a fan based on those things. And those become talking points for me and him as father and son. So it is, I don't want to over romanticize it or make it too nostalgic, but it's a connection point. It truly is.
Very, very well put. So you obviously got a phenomenal upbringing from your father. He mentored you and both your siblings, and you get your first gig as a board operator for the Broom Dusters, which is was a hockey team, which I think is now defunct, but in Binghamton, New York. And you were just 14 years old. So tell me a little bit about that gig.
So I do think the hockey team still exists. They're just not called the Broom Dusters anymore. Binghamton, New York, is in Broome County, New York. And that is also the home of a cartoonist by the name of Johnny Hart, I believe, who did a cartoon strip that featured these characters from Broome County. And that's where the Dusters came from. And as part of my dad's job, this was the other romantic part of radio, right? He was the general manager of this radio station for Stoner Broadcasting Company in Binghamton, New York. This was back in the 70s when general managers had cars as a perk. He had a country club membership as a perk, and he had season tickets to the minor league hockey team, which we broadcast on WNBF, the station that he was the general manager for. And so, I was a sports fan, and we went to all the hockey games, so I was a Duster fan, so I loved that. I was fascinated by play-by-play, and so I got to listen to the games while board opping them and playing commercials on carts. The hardest part of the job is we had one of those giant cart machines. Some of you will remember this, that was like a 1 minute just rotating loop, constantly recording. And if the Dusters scored a goal, you had to stop that so you'd have the goal for your post-game show. And however many goals they had, you'd have stacked up for the post-game show, goals 1 through X for the Dusters. Right. And you had to go back and replay that piece of play-by-play because we didn't have time to splice it with a razor blade and put it back together. We just would save it on these carts. But the real truth is, I always prayed for and wished for really short games because the games typically started at 7 o'clock and my shift didn't end until 10. So if the game got over at 9:30, that meant I got to play 30 minutes of music, and I got to talk up, intros and be a disc jockey, with my little, my little pre-puberty voice that nobody wanted to hear on the radio. But that's what I prayed for, because I loved board hopping the Broom Dusters game, but I really wanted to talk about Billy Joel's song. That's what I really wanted to do.
So your first passion was actually doing music radio. That's what you wanted to do.
Yeah, no question. I mean, again, there wasn't all sports radio then. I mean, people may not realize that, but I'm old. Back in the 70s, I mean, ESPN wasn't even on yet. ESPN didn't go on until 1979, The talk stations, most of them that I liked listening and learning from, had a sports show, typically like 6 to 8 p.m., that was like the thing. They would do talk all day, 6A to 6P, and then there would be a local sports talk host from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. that would talk about sports. But yeah, I was all about top 40 radio, man. I was born in Illinois, grew up on WLS, used to sit in my dad's car in the driveway and dial up AM radio stations across the country and listen to, radio stations from New York to Little Rock, Arkansas, to Denver, wherever they would come in from, some of those 50,000 waters at night. And
sure.
So WLS was the radio station that I dreamed of. It was, that's the one I listened to under my pillow every night with the transistor radio, was WLS, and the rock of Chicago and the jocks and the tempo and the pace and the production and the promotions. And again, it was bigger than life to me. It was magic.
Yeah, such an incredible radio station. Is that how you initially became a Cubs fan? Is in your connection to Chicago was through WLS?
No, I blame my dad for that one too. I was born in Illinois. My dad moved all over the place. He was from Iowa, but he was a Cubs fan, and so we were really lucky when we were little. They would, my parents would try to take us to Wrigley Field, once a year, and so that became a passion. And the other thing is WGN television. I mean, I lived in little towns when I was in kindergarten in Niles, Michigan. My dad was working in Niles, Michigan at the time. I would come home from kindergarten and the Cubs were on every day because they didn't have any lights at Wrigley Field. They played all afternoon games.
Right.
So the game would start at 1:15, 1:20, and I would be home from school at 3 and get to see, the last 4 or 5 innings every single day. And just fell in love with that and with them and with baseball in general. And so, yeah, it was a big part of it. And, before I go any further, I don't want to give my mom short shrift. My mom was an amazing mother, and she kept us all in line, including my dad.
Yeah, I've never met your parents or your siblings, but I got to believe your mom was the only normal one. So thank God for her.
She's an amazing lady, a farmer's daughter from Illinois. And she just, she's a great cook, and she was, different generation. She wanted to be home with us kids. But when my dad got into ownership, I'll tell you what my mom was. She was in charge of collections, man, and you did not want to be late paying our radio station. Just as she was in charge of discipline of us 3 kids, she was in charge of collections at the radio station. And boy, there were some people around town that'd be like, "Hey, I talked to your mom last week. I don't ever want to get that call again." I'd be like, "Yeah, you don't. You better pay. You don't want to get that call again." But yeah, she's an amazing lady, and I'm so blessed. They're both in good health. My mom's 78. My dad is 80. They're doing remarkably well, and we're blessed to still have them in our lives, for sure.
Oh man, that's fantastic. And I'm sure they've got to be really proud of all 3 of you. What incredible careers that you've had. I mean, your brother, major market general manager in Chicago, and also part of the Sports Hub. Your sister, incredible success, very successful host, and I'm really excited to get into the rest of your career here. I mean, you've really reached the pinnacle of sports radio. So I've got to believe they're pretty. They look back at you guys and are very proud.
Yeah, I hope so, and I think so. I mean, we have such a huge respect for the way they raised us, and I think that is returned by them to us in their pride, and how they talk to their friends about where we are and what we do and what we've been able to do in our lifetimes, and we've all been really lucky. So, and look, it starts with the parents and how you were brought up, and we were so fortunate to have such a good upbringing. But there's been a lot of, I think my brother would say this. I've talked about many of his, and for me too, there's been a lot of mentors and people who took us under their wing and gave us chances in this business that have, panned out. And so that's all part of a good fortune as well.
Before we get into the rest of your career, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here for a second, but you brought up the Cubs, and I was interviewing Tracy Johnson a few months ago. I don't know if you know Tracy or not, but a great programmer.
I do. Huge fan of Tracy's.
Such a good guy. He and a mentor of mine, he grew up a Atlanta Braves fan, and he credited, and I believe he grew up in Nebraska, but somewhere not near the Braves or that close to the Braves. But when he would get home from school, they would be on Turner Broadcasting. And so he was exposed to the Braves that way. And the Cubs had a very similar relationship with WGN. So people all around the country were exposed to the Cubs. Do you think that that's kind of missing today, where you would have a gigantic network that would broadcast one team throughout the country in regards to kind of fandom?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I recall exactly what you're talking about. It almost seems like those were the two America's teams, the Braves and the Cubs, and they were both on superstations, and that's what they called them. WGN was a superstation, TBS was a superstation, and the access to those teams was phenomenal. There weren't these regional sports networks at the time, so those two were the breakthrough teams, and it also made huge personalities out of their broadcasters. Jack Brickhouse for the Cubs,
sure,
and then Harry Carey, and of course Skip Carey for the Braves, and Don Sutton. And as I started to become a fan of broadcasting, I really started to fall in love with these crews and getting a chance to, hear them. And I remember watching the Cubs in the afternoon and the Braves at night, and really learning from those broadcasters as well. But yeah, that's, I think that's just part of the saturation of sports in general, right? I think two things. One, you don't have those teams that stand out because they're getting more exposure, but you also don't have players staying on the same teams for a long time like they did then as well.
True.
Which has really changed that. So yeah, those things are missing, but rather than look back on that and say, oh, those were the good old days and becoming, the get off my lawn guy, I think that's just part of the evolution of sports. It's still a remarkable piece of social currency. That's how I look at sports and sports radio, right? There's a social currency aspect of sports that is unlike anything but the weather. It's something that you can almost talk to anybody about. It's apolitical most times, and considering what we've been through in the last 19 months, to find something that's not politicized. And that's what I love about stadiums being full again, man. I mean, if I'm at a Cubs game, and Wilson Contreras, I had to pick a Cub that's still on the team because they traded everybody away. If Wilson Contreras hits a home run and I turn to the woman on my right and give her a high five, I don't care if she's Democratic or Republican or where she grew up or what religion she is. I just know that in that moment, we're both Cub fans.
Yeah.
And that's a huge part of what's missing in our world right now, man. It's just the things that we are so focused on the things that divide us. We're not enjoying the things that bring us together. And the beauty of watching sports again now with a full stadium is seeing people from different backgrounds high-fiving and hugging when their team scores a touchdown or hits a home run, and not worried about whether you have this position on masks or that position on politics. And that's a beautiful thing. I hope we can get back to appreciating that more so as we come out of this horrible pandemic.
That is such a great point. We forget that we're all on the same team.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you bringing that up. You're absolutely right. Let's get into you leave town. You've been now with your family, and now you take your first gig out of state. You go to Lake Charles, Louisiana. Tell me about that.
So yeah, there were a few stops along the way. I had the bio. It would have taken you a week to read the bio if I put every little tiny radio station on there. But I actually went away to work at a station in a little town called Danville, Illinois, which is the home of Jerry and Dick Van Dyke, by the way. That was my first job away from that was the first job away from my family. And the cool thing about that job, my dad was once the sales manager at WITY in Danville, Illinois. And that was my first job where I didn't work for my dad. And it was, a chance for me to get away and see what it was like. I lived by myself. I was there for a while. I ended up going back to Wisconsin to work for my parents because I had some health issues at that time that thankfully are long gone. And then I went to Lake Charles, Louisiana, to do mornings. That's when I was still on the air, still thinking I was going to be a star. That was fantastic. And this is one of the things, people say you move a lot, or, you move around as a radio person. I have zero regrets about the moves I made, because I will tell you that it's given me a chance to experience different cultures, different places, different people, different ways that people go about their lives. I mean, I was pretty sheltered, grew up in with a great set of parents, but I was all Midwest based. We moved a few places with my dad's job, but we had this very Midwest centric lifestyle. Louisiana, first of all, I'd never tasted food like that. It was the greatest food in the world in Louisiana. But then the mindset, like I was doing remotes in the morning, like 6 to 10 in the morning, and guys would pull up in pickup trucks with coolers full of beer saying, "Hey, you want a beer?" I'm like, "It's 8 o'clock in the morning, man." Well, come to find out, those guys worked on oil rigs, and they would be like 10 days on, 10 days off.
Oh.
So they'd be on the rig for 10 straight days. Then they'd come home. Well, it was 10 days of getting caught up on, partying and having fun. And they're like, "Hey, we're back from the rig. We're having a good time until we got to go back out in the middle of the ocean." And it was, again, you just learn things about people, and you learn to appreciate those different cultures and those different upbringings. The other thing that was amazing about Louisiana is everybody knows how to cook. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. If you grow up in Louisiana, your parents teach you how to cook. The guys can cook. The women can cook. The food it's the best. So that was a great experience. And it was a small town operator who had very high standards. I think at the time I thought they were kind of strict, and now I look back and think it was so perfect for me to have that kind of structure. Al and Dixie Johnson were their names. She used to be in the rep business, and they were an amazing family, and they did radio in Lake Charles, Louisiana, like it was in, Houston or Dallas or Los Angeles or New York. It was big time, and they expected the best, and they pushed us all hard, and that was a great experience. I was there for 3 years, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it.
And you were doing the mornings the whole time.
I was. Somehow I managed to stay in mornings that whole time. So, thanks to a lot of bad comedy services.
What was that like? Did you have a co-host around you or a producer, or were you doing it solo?
No, I was doing it solo. We were very music intensive. I did, do some bits with the midday person, and, we tried to goof off a little bit and have some fun, but it was, it was a top 40 station, Bayou 104, KBIU. And, we had a great time. We were very promotionally involved. We did a ton of stuff in the community. And again, that was the owners. They were so involved. And so you met everybody, and you got out on the street a lot. And, that's where you learn it all. That's where it all happens. So it was, again, I have no regrets. All these experiences add up to, what shapes you about how you treat people and how you look at the world. And so I have great memories of all of those things, and I feel like I learned a lot. And that's another thing about the moving. I just, the day I stopped learning, I don't want to be here anymore. I just think that every time you can learn about people and culture and places, it makes you a better person.
I love that attitude and that hunger for knowledge and for experience. I know you had several other stops along the way. Walk me through a few of the highlights. And I mean, you've worked at some legendary radio stations, obviously The Ticket, KLIF. You were in Pittsburgh at VTY. Fill me in on a few of the highlights and some of the lessons you learned at some of those stops.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. And again, the people you meet and work with, they sort of paint the picture for you and help you understand. Good leaders, it's interesting. I think that they teach you, many things that you can take with you and use in a positive way. And I think every leader teaches you a thing or two that you would rather not do when you get a chance to be a leader. Like you see it and you know how it makes you feel when you're like, hey. And I was always that guy. I was always taking notes. Like I love this about this person. If I ever get in their job, I'm gonna steal that and make it my own. And I really hate when this person, or dislike when this person talks to someone like that. I'm going to make a note of that, because I think there's a better way to deliver that message, and maybe if I ever get a chance to be a manager, I'll avoid that. But just back to your question specifically, I was in Lake Charles for 3 years, went over to Bryan, College Station, Texas, had a chance to work for a great gentleman by the name of Bill Hicks, part of the Hicks family. If you remember Steve Hicks and SFX, Steve was the first one to do an LMA. That was Bill's brother.
Okay.
And then his other brother, when I got to Dallas, was the owner of the Dallas Stars and the part owner of the Texas Rangers. But I worked for Bill Hicks, who is a great family man and was the manager of WTAW and Star 92 in College Station, Texas. I was only there for a little while because I got an opportunity to go to Charleston, West Virginia to work for V100, which was owned by Capital Broadcasting. There were a couple of different Capital Broadcastings back then. And the reason I did that is the woman I was married to at the time was from West Virginia. So it was a chance for us to go back to where she grew up. And we had a daughter at that time. And then had another daughter when we were in Charleston. So I went to V100, WVAF, had a chance to work with legendary morning guy by the name of Steve Bishop. And I was still on the air. I was still kind of following that music dream. I wanted to do music radio. And I applied for an open job at Pittsburgh at it wasn't WVTY at the time. It was still Gold 96, and they had a program director opening. And here's a guy I owe a lot to, too. The general manager there was a guy named Jim Carter, and it was Hearst Broadcasting. And, he had the courage and the guts to interview this little podunk PD from Charleston, West Virginia. And the way it happened was I didn't get a call from them, but Pittsburgh was close enough. I got in the car, put my family in the car, and booked a hotel in Green Tree, Pennsylvania, right outside of Pittsburgh. And I sat in a hotel room for about a day and a half and listened to the radio station and took notes. And then I sent all those notes to Jim Carter and got the interview. And now I got the interview.
Oh, no. So that took a tremendous amount of initiative. So he didn't invite you to be interviewed. You went there on your own accord, paid to get a hotel room, listened to the station for a day and a half, and then sent him the notes. Basically, he didn't request those notes.
He didn't request those. I typed up everything I heard, told him what I liked, what I didn't like, what I would change. Little did I know they were planning on changing the format, but still, I wanted to show the effort and how much it meant to me and how I believed I was ready for it, because there was a big piece of me that said, oh my God, I'm not ready for Pittsburgh. That's major market, but okay, I got to prove it to myself. So I'm going to go listen and see if I can pick up anything. And if I do, I'll share them with the general manager and see what happens. So he brought me in and interviewed me and hired me. And that was an amazing experience. I got to work with the legendary Alan Burns, who was the consultant for the station, and we flipped it from Gold 96 to Variety 96, became one of 3 variety stations in the country. Really had an amazing amount of success, thanks in large part to those people around me, because I was still learning how to be a good program director. It was the first place I went where we had a union, so I wasn't allowed to be on the air. So that was kind of my forced off the air situation, which was good. And I went full-time into management. And as it turns out, there was a really intelligent and amazing program director of our AM station, WTAE, a guy named Tom Clendening. And Tom, I learned so much from Tom, just a super smart guy. He's still doing radio. He's a part of the NPR family out in Everett, Washington. I haven't stayed in touch as much as I should, but Tom was running WTAE, and he got an opportunity to leave town and left. And I just went down the hall and said to Jim, I know I'm not qualified, but I want to learn more. If there's any chance I can be part of WTA or just help you in the interim while you hire somebody. And he took me up on that. He gave me a chance to learn spoken word radio. We carried the Steelers, we carried the Steelers on the AM and the FM. At that time, ESPN radio was on Saturday and Sunday nights, and we carried that because there was no sports radio. And so I kind of fell in love with those things. And it turns out, Jim made the decision to put me over both radio stations. And that's sort of where my love for this spoken word came in. And when Hearst sold those radio stations. And so it was a pretty precarious situation, as sales can be at times. And so I started looking around, and I got an opportunity to come to Dallas at that point. That was 97. when I left.
Really quick before we get into Dallas, if you don't mind, Pittsburgh was transitional on a few levels. One, you went into Pittsburgh really as a morning show host and wanting to be on air, but you made the transition into programming in Pittsburgh on your own initiative. You drove to town, air checked the radio station, send these great notes to the general manager, which I'm sure had to knock his socks off. I would imagine.
I don't know if they were great. I don't know if they were great or not. I think at the time I thought they were. I would be afraid to see them now, but it worked. It worked.
And so probably, I'm guessing from your upbringing and your father and, having a mentor like that in the business, you were groomed in a lot of ways to be a programmer, maybe not even knowing it. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think groomed probably without even realizing it. It was kind of inherent in my blood, from being around him and, hearing picking up on his knowledge. But I also think, at this point, this was, I went to Pittsburgh in 91. I've been, doing smaller market radio for 10 years. I think it was a natural gravitation too, Chachi. I think, I just started realizing the things that I had real passion for were a lot of them were really little things, like the order that the commercial should play in. Like I would sweat over that. Like I want the 60s first and I want the really hot jingles first. And then I want it to go down to the 30s and the 15s and I want the crappiest commercials at the end. I cared about that stuff. It's nerdy as hell, but that was the stuff I cared about. Or why do they play a jingle there? I would listen to radio stations and be like, I would never put a jingle there. Why are they playing a jingle before that or before the DJ talks? Or, and I just was always, obsessed about the order of things and the detail of things.
Sure.
So yeah, this gave me a chance, I think, to, when I made that transition and I got off the air, it also became about, better music scheduling, because suddenly you weren't worried about doing a 4 or 5 hour air shift every day. Right. So it gave me a chance to really dive into the details of, wanting to make every quarter hour count and wanting to make every promo, get as much exposure as the client, as the top client on the radio station, and understanding rotations and, points per week and things like that, and just, I became, and that's me. And sometimes, my wife would say to an OCD extent, but that's who I am and what I'm all about. But I think you nailed it. I hadn't really thought about that, but you're right. As I came off the air to take the job in Pittsburgh, it's when I really, maybe subconsciously more than consciously, started really dialing into programming and like just the passion for it and the love for it.
To be on the station that's carrying the Steelers, that's another, American franchise and a city that takes football incredibly seriously. So I imagine the details had to be really right at that radio station.
Yeah, it was. It was overwhelming. I still to this day think I'm just a, small town kid from a small place in Illinois. And I try not to, take for granted the opportunities I've had. And Pittsburgh was when some of that really started to crystallize. When you're in a room with the Rooney family, talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers, and then you go to Latrobe, Pennsylvania to training camp and you're standing next to, Bill Cowher and these players that are bigger than life, and, you're part of it. It's like, I got goosebumps. And the Rooney family, talk about learning from a family. They're so generous and just an amazing part of that community. And, I grew up with all Chicago sports allegiances, the Cubs being the deepest. And I will tell you, sorry, Chicago Bears, I became the biggest Pittsburgh Steelers fan ever living there those 7 years, because I got to see how they ran their franchise and how they treated people and the culture and what winning meant to them. And yes, that did translate to our radio station. It's a great point. When you partner with people like that, it becomes part of your culture too, because they raise the bar for everybody, right? There's an expectation. And if we got screwy or did something wrong or said something wrong, they weren't jerks about it, but they would point it out. They would be like, that's not how we treat that player. That's not what we would say about that player. Never told us what we could or couldn't do, but sent their message in a very clear way in that regard. And, very, very lucky to be part of that. And it was really cool. Really cool. In fact,
what an amazing opportunity.
Yeah. One of the coolest things I did before I moved to Dallas, the summer before, the Steelers actually played in Dublin. If you remember, they were doing those preseason games overseas. And,
I do.
And as part of the radio family, we got to go with the Steelers to Ireland, and it was a trip of a lifetime. And again, what other business gives you a chance to do stuff like that, right? It's like, God, this is fantastic. So been very lucky.
And that predates, I think they're going to do two NFL games now over in England this year?
Yeah, and they've done a great job at that series. The NFL has. They've got this new stadium in London now. So, I love that they're doing that. And those back then it was like a preseason game that meant nothing, but now they're doing these regular season games there that have become part of the fabric of the NFL, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
No, I think it's exciting. I know that there was a few games, I believe, in Mexico, MLB games, which I think were a great idea. And then we did the MLB did the Field of Dreams game a few weeks ago, which I thought was fantastic. And I guess that was the highest ratings for a televised game since a World Series several years back, which was pretty cool to see.
I thought they nailed it. Again, I'm an old sap. I'm in the demographic for Major League Baseball. I love that movie. I know a lot of people criticize the movie, but I think it's fantastic. It's a father-son movie. It's a baseball movie. It plays to all my romantic sensitivities. So I love the movie, and I thought baseball brought it to life. And then on top of it, they got an amazing game, with the Yankees going ahead in the top of the ninth and the White Sox, the White Sox walking it off in the bottom of the ninth. My brother, actually, the White Sox are on his radio station in Chicago. He was there. And
no way.
He talked about how, there were tears, there were goosebumps, there were cheers. It was magical. And I hope they can continue that tradition. And next year the Cubs are playing in it. So it's the Cubs and Reds next year. So I've got to find a way. If any of your great podcast fans has a hookup for tickets, let me know.
It's so funny we brought the game up, but Kevin, who produces the show for us and also a gigantic sports fan, he's a huge Raiders and Anaheim Angels, Los Angeles Angels now fan. But we were just talking about that game and just what a massive success it was, and I think we both agree with you completely. Incredibly romantic, and I think great for the game and just great for families. Really quickly, and just you brought up your brother, and I do want to take a quick tangent there. I know that he works for Good Karma, which is Mel Karmazin's son, correct?
That's correct.
That owns Good Karma?
Yep, Craig Karmazin.
Yes, Craig, and I hear phenomenal things about that company. I ran into Wexler, Steve Wexler, who is the general manager for the Milwaukee cluster. So he's your brother's counterpart up in Milwaukee. And he had told me at Lambeau Field that they own a few houses at Lambeau, and they'll bring listeners up to Lambeau and do these really cool kind of experiential events up there, which I think is just fantastic.
And if you've not been to Lambeau, that may not sound as cool as it is, because you have to realize that those houses they are literally across the street from the stadium. At any other stadium, they would be in the parking lot. That's how close they are to Lambeau Field. Look, I can't say enough good things about Craig. My brother loves working for him, and my brother has worked for, back in the day, it was Clear Channel. He worked many, many years for CBS, and then for a couple of years with Beasley before leaving Boston. And it's a whole different vibe. It's a very small company, and Craig is, a terrific leader. Him and Steve, who run it, Steve is his partner, who's down in West Palm. And I think this speaks for itself, and I won't give any names because I don't know them and I'll forget some people. But I remember talking to my brother, his first week there in Chicago working for Good Karma. And I think he told me that every person he met had been there a minimum of 10 years, and several people had been with them for 20 years. And that just says a lot about a company right there. Talk about culture. It's a very people-first company, but also one that, has diversified beyond just, advertising and done a really good job on the digital space. And so it's a good company. And talk about good genes. My God, Craig coming from Mel, Mel is an industry legend, and Craig, by the way, looks exactly like him. which is eerie. So, but he's great people. I'm a huge fan of Craig Karmazin.
I love, I come from I'm a programmer, as you know, but I've always really been a marketing guy at heart. And I just love to see radio stations do these bigger than life promotions. And here's like a once in a lifetime experience to go and stay at this house, literally right across the street from Lambeau, and have this, talking about sacred ground, that stadium, and obviously the Packers. And I just love to see those things, and the fact that they did something, in Iowa for the Field of Dreams experience. And I think that unfortunately as a whole, a lot of the industry has gotten away from doing these bigger than life promotions and these once in a lifetime type opportunities for our listeners. And I think those go a long way.
Couldn't agree more. I think that's been one of, radio still does really well in some traditional ways, particularly in the car. We know it works with advertisers. We see it all the time. We make cash registers ring. But I agree with you. I think the one thing we've gotten away from is the oh wow promotions, just kind of like and by the way, the great ones are the ones that get dreamt up in the morning and are on the air in the afternoon, because typically they're tied to something very topical, right?
Yeah.
And it's just something going on in your town, and it's like, we should do something about that. And I told you I worked for Bayou 104 in Lake Charles, Louisiana. I was lamenting this recently because I worked there with a guy who's one of our sports PDs now, Chris Baker, at the Sports Animal in Oklahoma City. And Chris was actually my boss in Lake Charles. So it's, again, small fraternity. But back in the late 80s, I guess, when I was in Louisiana, mid 80s, Boeing was down to 3 locations for possible plants for their building of a certain airplane. And Lake Charles was one of those cities that was on the list. They didn't end up getting it, but it was a huge story because Lake Charles isn't that big of a town. And so, this isn't the most unique idea ever. It's stolen, but one weekend we became Boeing 104 instead of Bayou 104.
That's awesome.
And we decided that on a Wednesday, and we did it on Friday, because it was in the news, and it didn't cost a lot of money, but it got all kinds of buzz. Every television station showed up to record us saying it. And,
yeah.
We put airplanes behind every sweeper, and I think we gave away inflatable airplanes and paper airplanes. And it was silly, but again, that's the magic. And I don't hear it enough anymore either, Chachi. I think it's one of the things we always did. You would find a wacky promotion and you go, oh, I wonder what radio station did it. Now you find a wacky promotion and then you trace it back and you're like, oh, it's not even a radio station. It's a company or it's somebody else. It's like, why aren't we doing that stuff?
No, it's a great story. I love that. Thank you for sharing it. In my apologies, I cut you off as you were getting ready to talk about Dallas. So walk me through how you got to Dallas and that jump from Pittsburgh.
Well, you didn't cut me off. I love moving around and having the conversation, and I appreciate it. And I think Dallas was an interesting time in my career because I loved Pittsburgh, and it was a great place to raise a family. Pittsburgh's an amazing city. And honestly, as I said earlier, I never thought I'd make it to a market as big as Pittsburgh to begin with. And, because of the way things went down in Pittsburgh, I actually at the end was the general manager. And it was solely because the station had been sold and I wasn't going to keep that job as general manager. Whoever the new company was, they were going to bring somebody in, and I knew that. But I was at a crossroads, do I deal with higher up in management? Do I step back into programming? What do I do? I was still doing music radio as well as talk radio. And when I got the opportunity in Dallas and I flew down and met with Dan Bennett, who is still the market manager in Dallas, and he was at that time too. And I was blown away by Dan. And the ticket, here's this radio station, 5,000 watts at 1310 on the dial, doing all sports. And I'm in Pittsburgh with a massive FM signal playing AC music and a smaller AM. And I'm thinking, what am I doing? And I took the job and I drove, from Pittsburgh to Dallas. And I'll never forget this. It was on Labor Day weekend in 1997. And the reason I'll never forget it is that's the weekend that Lady Di was killed in the car accident. Oh, wow. So on my drive down, I found out on the radio about Princess Diana. And it was Labor Day 1997. And I remember, you're in your car by yourself. I got it stacked to the ceiling. My family's still back in Pittsburgh. I'm going to Texas. I don't think I'd stepped foot in Texas in my life. And I'm leaving an AM/FM combo to go to work at a 5,000 watt AM. And in the course of that trip, my emotions went from, this is going to be great, it's all sports, to, holy hell, my career's over. I'm going to a 5,000 watt AM. What am I doing? My music radio days are over. What if this sports radio thing doesn't work? Because, in 97, there weren't that many all sports radio stations.
Sure.
But it turned out, obviously, to be one of the greatest decisions of my life. I have so many people to thank for that, not only because of Dan Bennett but the company Susquehanna, which was an amazing company with David Kennedy and Nancy Faith Duproff and, Dan Halliburton and the people in that company, Rick, the guys in Atlanta and the markets they were in, San Francisco and Indianapolis. And it was a whole new level of learning, and that's what I love about this business. I thought I knew a lot when I was in Pittsburgh, and then I got to Dallas, and it's like I didn't know anything. I learned so much more. And so the ticket is when I got into sports radio full time, and here I am, 25 years later, still, doing nothing, basically being focused on sports radio. So that was my entree into this format, and it's been amazing, and it's served me extremely well, and I'd like to think that all those people I had the chance to work with all helped shape who I am, and I learned a lot from each and every one of them. Too many to mention.
So you're at the Ticket, and you end up staying there for about 5 or 6 years, and then from there you become the general manager of ESPN, of the radio network, which is that's a big leap in and of itself. How did that come to be?
So one of the things that I didn't even realize, but at the time when I was programming the Ticket, ESPN Radio was a joint venture between ESPN in Bristol and the ABC Radio Networks, which were located on Montfort Street in Dallas.
Sure.
And the guys and women who worked in the ABC Radio Network offices, they were responsible for affiliating ESPN to stations across the country, and they did all of their trafficking of their advertising. So they did all the backroom stuff for ESPN. Well, come to find out, many of those men and women at the ABC Radio Networks building were huge Ticket fans. They loved the Ticket. They listened to the Ticket every day. And at that time, the Ticket was the only sports station, so we also were the ESPN affiliate. We carried their stuff at nights and weekends and all their play-by-play.
Okay.
And so when the opening came up in Bristol, a guy by the name of TJ Lambert, who headed up all the affiliation for the ABC Radio Networks for ESPN, mentioned my name to the folks in Bristol, and they interviewed me, and I talked to several people. It was a grueling interviewing process, and I was unbelievably intimidated. Even after doing all that I'd done in my radio career, it was, this was ESPN at the height of ESPN. It was a juggernaut. It was carrying the Walt Disney Company at that time. This was 2003. I interviewed for the job late in 2002. Throughout, it took about 6 months. So from like July of 2002, and I started in February of 2003 in Bristol. And I'll tell you to this day, I mean this sincerely, every day that I went through those gates at ESPN, I had a surreal moment in my stomach, in my brain. I couldn't believe that this stupid little radio schmuck was, running the radio network for ESPN. It's like, how could I be so damn lucky? It was unbelievable that I was there. I still sometimes have to pinch myself and remember what it was like to be there. So that was phenomenal. It was just, right place, right time, I guess. And they really wanted to have somebody with a deep-rooted radio background because they had so much TV influence at that company. And so I got lucky in the timing, and they took a chance on me, and it was remarkable. And yeah, I will tell you, that's what's amazing about all these moves. There was a time when I was in Pittsburgh, Chachi, where I thought I would never leave Pittsburgh. There was a time in Dallas when I thought I'll never leave Dallas. And, and then I was every day at ESPN, I thought I'm never leaving this place, man. There's bonuses, there's Disney stock. Life is great. I had an office in New York. I had an office in Bristol. It's like, man, this is the shit. It's like, this is great, And then something came along, which I'm sure you're going to get to. But it's been amazing.
I'm curious about, now you've programmed, 2 massive major market sports stations. And so that's a heck of an education in and of itself. But now this transition into the network space, and of all networks, ESPN, which is really the crown of, it doesn't get any bigger than that in the sports world. What was that transition like?
Yeah, it was, it's funny. You only know what you know, right? So I think the reason the transition worked for me is because, and again, timing means so much. They needed, and this is my hindsight view, and they may, those that were there may disagree, but I think they needed me and I needed them. And what I mean by that is they needed an education on how local radio worked, because they were doing network radio in a certain way. And I'll tell you a story specific to that in just a minute. And then I needed time to understand how network radio works, because it is a different animal. And so I think, everything was just aligned in a beautiful way where, they didn't ever see ratings. You're sitting in Bristol and you're producing all these shows, but the radio stations got the ratings. You didn't. You couldn't analyze them and look at them, and you only got what people shared with you. And so just trying to help them understand how ratings work and what that process is so that we could be more effective for the local radio stations. That was where my knowledge was. And I needed them to help me sort of understand how big we could be, yet still be small. And that's a lesson I'll always take from Dan Mason. That was one of Dan Mason's great lines. And Dan, who is just another one of my many mentors that I've had the good fortune of being around, Dan would say, take something big and make it small, bring it down to, that local community. And that's what we had to try to do on the network every day without mentioning specific places. And the story I wanted to tell you is this one. And I think this was a crystallizing moment, and it was specific to the Mike and Mike show. And, we were working so hard to make that show work, and Greeny and Golick were just so committed and all in, and they wanted to be the very best that they could be. And they had a mentality that was, that permeated through ESPN, which is watch SportsCenter at night and then try to make that your morning show the next day. And so they would do that. But then they got caught up in what happens in network radio. They got caught up in all the markets they were in. So they would say, well, we're going to take the SportsCenter stories, but then we're on in Des Moines, we're on in Chicago, we're on in pick markets, right? We're going to go into those local newspapers. We're going to find the stories in those markets. We're going to talk about all those things. And it wasn't working. And it was hard. It was really hard. It was like all this stuff from SportsCenter, then all this stuff from these individual markets. And, there's like 3 producers working on the show, and they're all trying to collate this stuff and make it work. And we got in a room one day, and it doesn't matter who it was a collective. That's how I've always tried to manage. You get a team of people together, and you come out of there unified. And we said, here's the mistake we're making. There's only 1 or 2 really big sports stories every day. Let's just talk about those. Forget all the other stuff. And it really became, instead of the mantra of let's watch all of SportsCenter, let's watch the first 7 minutes of SportsCenter. And if it doesn't make the first 7 minutes, we're not even going to talk about it on the radio show. And it was a crystallizing moment for everybody that is like, you know what, this is where Play the Hits came from. There's all these great stories, and many of them are worth talking about, but we're trying to cover the whole country. There's going to be 1 or 2 stories that resonate, and that's what we have to be focused on. And Mike and Mike, to their credit, really latched onto that and did a remarkable job with it and sort of set the table, for the rest of the day.
Man, that's amazing. I had never thought of that, but that makes so much sense now. Looking back at it, I'm like, that's brilliant. I never even really thought that it was done the other way, but that's a tremendous idea.
Well, something I learned from you recently, because you brought to my attention the interview with Ken Burns on 60 Minutes, that's a great example of what he talked about. You think preparing for a show is an additive process, but it's actually a subtractive process. And I didn't even realize how true those words were when I heard Ken Burns say them. It made me flash back to that ESPN story. We basically were trying way too hard to do way too much. And when we started subtracting from that show prep, we actually made the product demonstrably better.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that. That's a great advice, and I'm sure very useful for hopefully people that are listening. So from ESPN, and what an amazing gig and experience that was and had to have been, you then go and work for a billionaire, Dan Snyder, and you take the COO position of his broadcasting company, Red Zebra. How did that come to be?
So there was a guy at ESPN who was a remarkable leader, still is, a guy by the name of Mark Shapiro. And Mark was the head of all of programming at ESPN, and he was this prodigy. I mean, I think when I went to ESPN, Mark was 20-something, and he was running all of programming at ESPN under George Bodenheimer, who was the president. And Mark was the most motivating person I've ever been around, a remarkable leader, great talent. And Mark left ESPN during my tenure. And Mark went to work for Dan Snyder, who also at that time, aside from owning the Washington Redskins, owned Six Flags, the amusement park company. And he named Mark the CEO of Six Flags. And Mark brought a couple of people with him from ESPN to Six Flags. And then Dan wanted to start this radio network. And I wasn't, I knew Mark. I had a couple of meetings with him. I admired him. I didn't think he knew that much about me. But when Dan had this opening, Mark Shapiro said, hey, we had a guy running ESPN that I think you should talk to. And he gave Dan Snyder my name. And I'll never forget that day when Dan called me and said, hey, I want to talk to you. I'm going to send my helicopter. I ended up not riding on his helicopter, which I should have figured out a way to do that. But I said, look, I said, are you going to be in New York anytime soon? I'm already in New York. I don't have to ride your helicopter. He goes, as a matter of fact, I'll be in New York next week. So we got together in person in New York. I should have held out for the helicopter ride.
I can't believe you passed on the helicopter ride, man. That would have been worth the admission ticket alone.
Yeah, so we had dinner in New York, and we talked, and not long after that, Dan asked me to come run his company. And look, he had 3 DC area stations. He had a station in Richmond and a station in Norfolk, Virginia Beach. And his dream was, and his desire was, because he had this amazing brand, the Washington football team, now at the time the Washington Redskins, his desire was to build this mid-Atlantic broadcast company, and then we were going to go public. And so, I didn't know that much about IPOs and going public and all those things. And I thought, then I read up on it, and Mark and I talked a lot, and I conferred with a lot of people that I, admire and have been mentored by over the years. And it became apparent that this was a potential once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Now, keep in mind, this was February of 2007. I had been at ESPN only 4 years, again, thinking I would never leave there. So I went to work for Dan in early 2007, and we quickly went from about 5 radio stations. We got up to about 13 radio stations, and then the crash happened in 2008. And again, timing. I've talked about when timing has been on my side, and I've been very lucky. Like when I went to work for ESPN, this was a case where timing was unlucky. Now, I say that, I'm a glass half full guy. In a course of a little over 3 years with Dan Snyder, I learned how to negotiate and buy radio stations and how to quickly sell radio stations, because once the crash happened, we had to get rid of them. Plus, I was in board meetings with billionaires who would casually talk about the stock market and investing, and from a high level, I really truly believe it was my MBA, Chachi. I mean, it was my MBA in broadcasting. I thought I knew a lot about advertising and sales and programming, but I didn't know how all the financing worked, and it became a whole different level of education that I, again, have zero regrets, and in fact, I'm quite grateful and thankful for. And I know a lot has been written and said about Dan Snyder, and I'm not here to judge what's true and not true. I will just say this. He treated me and my wife wonderfully and did everything he said he was going to do as a boss.
For those of you who don't know Dan Snyder's a billionaire. He started, I believe, it was advertising company. I think they did like inside malls and doctors' offices, and he became a millionaire, if I recall. Like, he's a college student, was a millionaire by the time he was a college student, started this company. I think he ended up selling it to a gigantic agency for hundreds of millions of dollars, bought the Washington football team, built this network. But I think at one time too, when he took his first company public, he was like maybe the youngest or one of the youngest people ever to have a publicly traded company. Guy was just and a marketing business genius. So to have that type of education is, I'd love to have been a fly on the wall in some of those meetings. That is an amazing education.
Yeah, I was doing radio, which I love, but it was the meetings that I found myself just fascinated by, because it was, you're right, it was like I was like the fly on the wall because I couldn't speak in those terms or in that language. I had to learn it, and they taught me a lot. And to your point about Dan, he's self-made. I mean, he grew up. His dad was a writer for UPI, and his dad was a huge Redskins fan, and all Dan ever wanted to do was buy that team for his dad and make his dad proud. And his dad was still alive when he bought it, passed away shortly thereafter. But there's some great stories there too. And again, experiences that I would have never had if I hadn't taken those leaps of faith at the time. So that was my broadcast and financial MBA years, those few years in Washington, D.C.
Sure. So did you go to D.C.? Were you living in Washington, D.C. at that time?
Yeah, I was living in Bethesda, Maryland, as a matter of fact, yeah.
Got it. And then from there, so the recession, and I was part of that too. That's when I was let go from Clear Channel, so I know that time very well. So then in 2010, you go back, I think, to Dallas as the head of CBS Radio Sports Programming and Talk at KRLD, The Fan, and the Texas State Network.
Yeah, that was, again, relationships through the years that have been built, and Dan Mason was running CBS, and, they had a couple of opportunities in some other markets, and, my wife and I had just had our son, Hudson, and Amy and I were, sitting down one night in D.C., and it's like, look, all that's changed here. Let's make a list of where we want to live. And Amy grew up in Houston, went to SMU, and so Dallas was on both of our lists. I had children here from my first marriage that were now adults. And I think we had one other city on that list, and it was Phoenix, because we both happened to love Scottsdale in the Phoenix area. But it became apparent we wanted to get back to Dallas. And, at the time, one of the greatest legends and one of the guys I look up to most was at KRLD. And that was Tom Bigby, who just passed away last year. And Tom is a legend from WIP in Philadelphia, did some amazing work with the Ticket in Detroit, and was running KRLD. And it just so happened that Tom was getting ready to wind down. And so again, luck of the timing, Tom was welcoming of me replacing him. Chris Olivero was very involved in it, and Dan Mason was very involved in it. And I had a chance to come in and be part of KRLD, which was cool because it was CBS, which was a company I'd long admired, and Dan Mason, who I looked up to.
Sure.
But it was also incredibly awkward because they were competing against the Ticket. And the Ticket was such a huge part of my DNA. And all of the guys that were on the Ticket when I left in 2003 were still on the air, with the exception of one guy that was actually on the Fan when I got there on KRLD and moved across the street. And so that was weird, just from a pure competitive perspective, but still, terrific. It got us back to Texas. And I've been lucky to be able to stay in Texas since we made that move, even though I've now worked for, CBS for those 2 years, then iHeart, and now Cumulus. I've been fortunate that they've allowed me to continue to have my residency here in the great state of Texas. So we're loving life and feel very lucky.
So geographically, that move was great for you because you've been able to stay there now the entire time, which is fantastic. But you did leave CBS after a couple of years and then went to iHeart to be the VP of their sports network. What was that like? And Fox Sports as well.
Yeah, it was great. Again, it's a lot of times who you come in contact with and who you know. There was a guy I competed against in Pittsburgh by the name of Carl Anderson. Carl was running the jazz station in Pittsburgh when I was at WTAE and WBTY, and we got to know each other and stayed in touch a little bit through the years. And Carl had taken a position at iHeart at that time on Tom Pullman's programming team, and he recruited me and And it's funny you brought up, living here and this being my residence. I mean, the Fox Sports Network is in Los Angeles. There was some talk about moving. And I just said, look, I love working for the guys at CBS, and I just don't want to move. I've moved so many times. My wife went to SMU. She loves it here. We feel like Texas is home. I got adult children here. And iHeart was nice enough to say, we're cool with that. You can live in Dallas. We want you to have this job. And I was only at iHeart a couple of years. It was a transitional time. Mr. Hogan was still there, and Pittman and Bressler were taking over. Sports wasn't their most important thing, but they did it really well. And, what I found out at iHeart is several things. One, the Premier Network is an amazingly run network. And there's some really good people there. And Don Martin, who is at KLOC in Los Angeles and had been a very instrumental figure in Fox Sports Radio since the untimely passing of the great Andrew Ashwood, who used to run Fox Sports, who we all admired and died way too young from cancer. Don had really done a remarkable job. And I'm not going to say that for the first time. Well, maybe I will say for the first time. I mean, I felt like I had something to offer, but you know what? I didn't feel like I was that needed because Don was a good leader and had done a really good job. And Carl was just trying to really beef up the management team. And so, we had to work through sort of, the right lanes and the right things. I'll say that, it was just, it didn't end up being as great a fit as I would hope. But Julie Talbott, you want to talk about one of the most remarkable leaders in our business, just the greatest lady who puts people first. She mentored me through sort of that process and respecting, what Don had created, because I didn't want to step on his toes because he's a great leader in and of himself. And we had a lot of really good shows and products, and I was able to work with some of the great PDs inside the iHeart radio stations. So it was good. And the app was coming along. They were trying to figure out what to do with sports on the iHeart radio app. I met Larry Linieski there, who now works for Westwood One. We're back together, working together.
Sure.
But it just, that one never really, I was commuting to LA every other week. I loved it because I love everything I get to do in this business. I try not to take it for granted, but it never quite locked in. I never got quite in a groove there, and it's probably much my fault than anybody else's. But I left there with great respect for those folks and what they had done, and knew that they were in great hands, especially when they hired Scott Shapiro to come out and run the Fox Sports Network, who I worked with at ESPN. And Scott's done a remarkable job. I think the Fox Sports Radio product is as good as it's ever been, and him and Don have done that together. And I have admired them and cheered for them from afar. Look, it's interesting. I came into Dallas because Dallas was still a network hub for Cumulus, because they took over when they bought Citadel. They got the ABC radio networks. So I came into the offices in Dallas, the ABC radio network offices, which was now part of Cumulus, to go over the iHeart sports stations and which ones were going to carry Westwood One's NFL football. And I was sitting with Dennis Green in his office at the old network building here in Dallas. And we were going through every iHeart market and talking about the football season. So this was probably about this time of year. And he said, hey, John Dickey's in town and wants to have lunch. Since we're doing this, let's finish up and we'll go meet him, down at the W for lunch. And I knew John because they were a big ESPN affiliate. Every time we would go to the All-Star game when I was at ESPN, the Dickeys were there. And so we get to lunch. It's not just John, it's also Lew.
Oh, wow.
And they ask how it's going at iHeart, and I give them a little, tell them how it's going, and I'm, finding my way, but I love it. There's great people. We got a lot to accomplish. And they said they'd really like for me to come to work for them. And that was in 2014. And by the time we got through the negotiation and the discussions, I started here in January of 2015. So now in my 6th year with Cumulus and Westwood One, obviously there's been a lot of changes. That was January 15 was, 10 months before the Dickeys were then, removed from the company, and Mary Berner took over. And, I think, I really like John and Lew. They were great to me. Obviously they gave me an opportunity that I still have today, thanks to them. But I also have enjoyed the evolution of the company and where we're at, and working for a guy that I know you get to work with day to day now, Mike McVay, who has always been a hero of mine. Who I forgot to mention, that's when I first came across Mike McVay, was Charleston, West Virginia. So it's interesting how these things go back, right? So
no kidding.
That job in Charleston, Mike McVay's company consulted us. Jerry King was the guy who I worked directly with, but Mike McVay was this guy on a pedestal that I thought was great. So I got to work with McVay there, then Alan Burns in Pittsburgh. And, then McVay comes back around as this job came to be. And I got in with Mike, and, it's the first time we had really worked, together on a management team. So that was great. And then Mary, really changed the culture of the company in a properly evolutionary way. And Suzanne Grimes, who runs Westwood One, is the president of Westwood One, has become a mentor and a teacher. And we have some amazing leadership with Mary and Suzanne and Brian Phillips on the programming side, who I worked with in Dallas. When I was at the Ticket, Brian was at the Wolf. So a lot of these people come back around in your life. And I say that to say, I just had a conversation with somebody this morning about this. It's not hard to be a good human. It's not hard to be good to people and be nice. And in our business, there's a chance that the people you're talking to and hopefully treating right today will be your bosses tomorrow. And it's happened to me. It's happened to me in my career. And I thank God for that upbringing we talked about with my great parents, who taught me to respect everybody, treat everybody the same, and treat people the way you want to be treated and be a good human. And I am grateful that I had those lessons young in life, and have had them reinforced by great leaders that I've worked for through the years, because it definitely has shaped where I'm at and who I've had the good fortune of being around in my career.
Man, such great advice, and I could not agree more. You treat people so incredibly well, and I think, unfortunately, as a whole, the industry sometimes gets a reputation for eating our own, and I love the fact that you really just take care of people so well and treat them well, and I'm so grateful for the support that you've given us over the years. Something I wanted to mention is Carl Anderson was actually very instrumental in Benztown and helping us early on, back when he was at Citadel Media Networks, ABC Radio Networks, and he was very helpful to us and is a great guy. Carl is now, I think he runs a car dealership. Is that correct?
He's in the car business in Tucson, Arizona, and he's doing quite well. I hate that he's not still in our business, because I think he's a good leader, and I learned a lot from Carl too. He's a sharp guy. So I didn't know that about Benztown, but now I remember that Citadel was very involved with you guys at the beginning, and that's pretty cool.
That's when so much was happening, when John and Lew bought Citadel and then Dial, and it was all moving very quickly. But yes, it was eventually Mike McVay and Dennis Green who ended up finishing our deal, but it was really Carl and John Rosso at the time who kind of got things going, and really good guys. And you've worked with some incredibly talented people. I worked with Don and his wife Robin back when I was the program director here at MyFM, and Don's an incredibly bright guy, still at KLAC today, and involved there. I'm really good friends with Dave Weiss, their marketing director. So they're very busy. They got all the Dodger games here.
Yeah.
So
well, Don's good, but let's be honest, his wife can program circles around him, man. Robin's the star. She's amazing.
She is. She's incredible. She is incredible. Yeah, no, early. I mean, this was very early on in my career, and so I got very fortunate and was programming here at a young age. But Don taught me a lot early on. I mean, candidly, I was kind of scared shitless of him at the beginning because he's such a strong personality. But
he's a big personality. Yeah.
Yeah. But he would pull me into his office, and he gave me some great advice over the years, and certainly grateful for that. Man, one more person I want to mention, because you've got so many talented people in your life, but your wife Amy is also the host of a fantasy football podcast called First and 10, which is incredible. So you've got talent all around you, man. Your dad, your brother, your sister, your wife. How do you do you find yourself giving advice to them, or do you just more kind of listen?
No, I'm the trailer on that. I just pick up the pieces. They're way better and smarter than me. Yeah, my wife is the real talent. See, I just took that shot at Don. I'm glad you brought up Amy, because Amy runs circles around me too. My wife is amazing. She's an artist. She makes beautiful mosaic guitars that are just unreal, and she's doing really well with that business. She's a real estate agent. She's really good at that. And she does this podcast called First and Tens, which they've been on hiatus for a while because she got so busy with her art. But they're getting ready to start back up. And she does it with a woman named Jasmine Sadry, who also does mornings in Nashville and on WKDF with Paul Coffey. And her and Jasmine have a great chemistry. They're very good friends. They're both incredibly hilarious. It definitely gets the E for explicit, just to give everybody a fair warning. They like to cuss, but they're very creative cussers, I must say. But and here's the other thing I love about it. I mean, my wife will study and research, and she's a big football fan to begin with, but she gets into it. Like, she gets deep into the stats and the details and has some really good information, which is sometimes demeaning, right? When I'll bring up something about a player and she'll be like, no, you're not even close to right. This is what happened with that player. I'm like, oh, okay. I'm just the sports programming guy. What do I know? Thanks for bringing her up, because she's amazing. And,
nope. Please send us a link if you don't mind, and we'll include her podcast in the show notes. Love to include that. And any pictures of the mosaic guitars. Those sound incredible. Are they acoustic guitars?
So she takes acoustic guitars. You can't play them. It's just an art piece. They're meant to be hung as a piece of art, but she takes acoustic guitars, sometimes used ones, sometimes, inexpensive new ones. And, she sands them down, and she makes incredible designs. Hand-cut glass. She cuts every piece by hand. No two are alike. And she can do logos, and she does, rock. And she's done a rock series like an Elton John guitar, Prince guitar, Grateful Dead, the Allman Brothers, and a lot of them are commission pieces. But it's high-end art. It's beautiful. And, she's got a website called glassaxes.com, as in, GLASSAXES, glassaxes.com. And the pictures really don't do them justice. The pictures are beautiful, but they're in 3D in real life. They're absolutely gorgeous.
Sounds amazing. Yeah, we'll definitely include those in the show notes as well. Thank you for that. Two more quick questions for you. So one, and I like to ask my sports friends this, would you rather be the manager of the Chicago Cubs or the head coach for the Pittsburgh Steelers?
Cubs manager, undoubtedly. Not even a hesitation.
Second question for you. Do you think, I know that Dan Mason was very instrumental throughout your career, and Dan has gone on to do some play-by-play. I think he calls some college basketball games. Do you think you'll someday go and do that when you decide to kind of maybe retire or slow down a little bit?
It's funny you say that. I don't miss being a disc jockey anymore. I did for a long, long time on a music radio station, but I do miss doing play-by-play. And the extent of my play-by-play was high school. I mean, I did high school basketball, high school football, high school hockey, because I grew up in Wisconsin. When I was in high school, I was in Wisconsin. And I did hockey games outdoors, standing in snowbanks in the corner, broadcasting play-by-play of hockey. And you'd hear me sniffling all the way through because I was so cold my nose was running. But I miss that. I think a dream of mine is just to even do like one minor league baseball game, and then if that turned into something, that'd be cool. But I would love that opportunity to be in the booth and have a chance to experience that. Yeah, that's a love for sure.
Well, I would love to hear that game. I hope you do that, my friend. All right, but I know I said two questions, but I've got a bonus question for you. So you've got two adult daughters, Danielle and Amber, and then you also have two stepsons, Michael and Jason. And obviously your dad was incredibly instrumental in your career, and your sister and your brothers, and you all got into radio. Do you see any of your kids following your career path?
So my oldest stepson, Michael, who just turned 40, is a manager for the Studio Movie Grill, but for about 8 years, he was doing part-time sports talk on The Fan, KRLD here in Dallas.
No kidding.
And I did bring him on when I was the program director. And the reason I did is Michael was that kid, when he was growing up in my household, he was the kid that could remember every stat, everything about everything. And actually, when I came back to The Fan, it's when the UFC was taking off, and Michael had taken a huge interest in UFC and was going to Las Vegas for the fights, and really was incredibly knowledgeable about the sport and what it was and where it was going, and was doing special reports on some of the UFC pay-per-view events, and then that parlayed that into a weekend show. His management job in the movie industry finally got, he kept getting promotions, and he had to give up the on-air thing. So he did do that. My daughters had zero interest, which is fine. And Jason has always been more of a technical guy. and works for a company that houses records for all kinds of industries digitally. So they've all been very successful. I'm extremely proud of all of them. But no, I think I've successfully steered them away to some extent. Although Michael was really good because he liked to argue too, which made him a good sports talk host. But I think he made the right choice. He's doing really well in the business he's in, and it's been really hard for him the last year and a half because of COVID with being in the theater business. But he's managed and maintained and is doing great.
Hey man, want to thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a lot of fun and so great to learn about you.
Well, it's very kind of you to do it. I'm not sure anybody will care a whole lot about all this, but I will say that I've had a wonderful and amazing ride, and I hope it lasts a lot longer because I feel like there's still a lot in the tank. I want to keep doing this and be a part of it. It keeps me young, and I find great joy in watching great talent grow and succeed, and watching great brands grow and succeed, and getting to be part of the Westwood One sports broadcast of the NFL and the NCAA. It's a joy, and want to keep on keeping on. So thanks for giving me a chance to tell my story, and thanks for all you do for the radio industry with your webinars and your production and everything. You guys are an amazing company. You should be really proud, and grateful to have a chance to be part of that ecosystem as well.
Thanks for listening to Chachi Loves Everybody. If you like the show, we hope you'll leave us a 5-star rating and tell your friends. Make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. This has been a Benztown podcast production, hosted and researched by Dave Chachi Dennis, executive producer Kevin Horton, show coordinator Juliana Parisi and Laura Keeney.